gopola ho tjea mo bona video ko tjea se ba di ho ba ka program
Yeah.
o sa ntwa
Yeah.
re to mo go ba di mo YouTube mo
No, on YouTube.
no one
Ke upload.
taba jane mo re kwa
On the yeah.
After ke no go re kwa pele nyana
Yeah, it's bad.
Kuri bile ke gore a fetwa gore la ke mmata re tjea ga re tjela ke e late go the empire go the NPA go the MDF and then it's on there
The idea is still left. Re ka no fetja gae. Eba batho ga le ba mo banal course.
on
Should do what? Yeah. True. Ish, what woman over our microphone. So I can't crash sound here. We let her have. No la camera. Sino sa. Tuma first year, bra. Perfect, the whole world. Oh yeah, let's go there. What she said. I gotta say off. Radio Trinity camera.
As always. Ke nagana go ara vela o re tshwere ke tšhelo.
Yeah. Okay.
Kuzwanga kwathi
Get me. Get me. Sì, sì, sì.
that are very easy to press and they turn red. Please be aware that if you send that toy, it turns my microphone off. If you press that toy in front of you, the microphone, if yours is red, mine goes off. So please, let's not press that button, otherwise, while the guest speaker is speaking, you press and we can't hear you. The idea is, during the question answer time, you are able to press there and speak, and we can hear you. So please do not press. If it is red, like this now in front of me, somebody press that right now. I go ahead. All right. Welcome to the 8th annual Archbishop Thabo Makgoba lecture. This is one of the memorable occasions we have year after year since it started. The song that they just sang, Ham Yo Sebenza, encourages us to use our own land to feed ourselves. And the speaker today will also encourage us in one way or the other how we can use the talents we have, how can we use the resources we have, how can we use what we learn in the classrooms for it to become practical, for it to increase the value of our lives and improve our way of living, our standard of living. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you are looking forward to a wonderful guest lecturer that I for the first time, the hall was full before the guest speaker could arrive. I was highly impressed. I thought I knew the guest speaker, but after watching the hall getting full before he arrived, I think I know very little about him, and we are about to find out. Let me start by just inviting the choir to officially open the proceedings with the national anthem. We can all join in, and let's please rise for the singing of the national anthem. Choir, please do your magic. Thank you very much. We may remain seated. In South Africa, our land indeed, and somebody wrote a book, The Land is Ours. I will not disclose who wrote that book, but in South Africa, our land, and somebody wrote the book, The Land is Ours. And in that book, he says, in this age of aggressive colonial expansion, we have our talent, we have our skills, we have our land to plow. We have a dispensation that our constitutional system should support and eliminate poverty through equipping our people with the means they have and broadening the horizons that they can use to plow the lands and feed their homes. I do not know who wrote that book, but it will come to light at some point. Let me invite the father of this university to come and welcome the guests. I have not observed protocol. I have not recognized the guests in this hall, but the Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University, Professor Mokhalong, please come and welcome the guests.
Thank you, Program Director. I honestly don't know why they gave you a microphone with that wild voice of yours. You don't need any amplification of your voice. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is true that for some reason, it's for the first time the lecture is attended by so many. But I'm sure by the end of the proceedings, we will know why so many of you attended. And let me welcome you all to this occasion, our 8th Archbishop Makgoba's public lecture. We started with it 8 years ago. And I want to welcome the Arch. I know where he is. He's following the proceedings. And I'm sure he's happy that we are not disappointing him. When he came with the original funding, he said, every year, let's make sure that we talk about issues around rent, issues around livelihoods. And that's where it is. A special word of welcome to my colleagues in management, my academic colleagues, and of course, our lovely students. Thanks for coming. I know you're busy preparing yourselves for the weekend. So, I had so many stories about you and your weekend, but I know you're looking forward to it, but thanks for knowing that there are things that come before that weekend. Program Director, with your choir, thanks that you're there. A word of welcome to Violet Mulepo Lokhotwane from the Polokwane Anglican Church with your colleagues there, Muruti Masipa, Marumo Mabucha, Joyce Dube, Khabo Ledwaba, Ernest Mugashwa from the Legal Aid of South Africa, again from the Anglican Church in Polokwane, Mushidi Kwiting, Hope, Mohlali. Let me welcome the MMC from the Capricorn District Municipality, responsible for local economic development, Mayor Caroline Mamabolo. Honorable Dixon Masemula, MEC, Social Development from the Limpopo Provincial Government. Makgoba family, I know you never miss this dito. We welcome you and thanks for always being part of this occasion. I know I cannot mention you all by name, but you all welcome. A special word of welcome to Tembeka Ngwaitovi. Say thanks for having agreed to come and share your ideas with us. And I can guarantee you there will not be anybody springing up on you to say objection or objection sustained, not today. So feel free to share your ideas with us. And thanks for really coming through and agreeing, because when the Arch said, I'm looking for Tembeka, I said, I think that's a good choice. I hope his tight schedule will allow him to be with us. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not the one to be making speeches today. We invited him to come and talk to us and share ideas with us. You are all welcome. And don't come and say, yeah, but you didn't mention me by name. In your heart of hearts, tell yourself, I did mention your name. Thanks, Program Director.
Thanks, Prof. Now that protocol has been observed, we know who the guests are. We know who the what protocol refers to. I'll then say all protocol observed. Can I ask the choir to welcome our guests properly after our Vice Chancellor and Principal has spoken? Let us get people welcome as they walk in. Let's get them settled down. The feelings of a first black lawyer sitting in a court, the feelings of the first black advocate standing in front of a judge during those times would attract a lot of enthusiasm. The court will be filled simply to find out what is this black lawyer going to be saying in court. Because during those times, we know you wouldn't have a black lawyer in court. And such feeling still resonates in some quarters where blacks are rare in their corners. But let us enjoy our Africanism and our soil of Mzansi. Choir.
Ari mutulishe, usone lwaki
Halala, UL Choir, halala. I'm not saying halala because I'm part of them. I'm just saying halala because they've just sung well. Professor Mokalong has welcomed us. Now we are going to listen to the reason why this all began from the source himself. He is not here today, but he was kind enough to record the message for us, the Archbishop Thabo Makgoba. We will listen to the message as he speaks for us. He is currently outside the country.
Members of the University Council, the Rector and Vice Chancellor, Professor Mokalong, our esteemed Speaker, Senior Counsel Advocate Tembeka Ngaku, Aitobi, Deputy Vice Chancellors, Deans, the Program Director, Professor Hlongwane, our esteemed guests, students, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this Archbishop Thabo Makgoba Development Lecture. I am so sorry that I am unable to join you this morning on this 8th public annual lecture. I'm deeply sorry about that. 5 weeks ago, I traveled to Makgoba's and to Moriam, and I paid a courtesy visit to His Grace, the Archbishop Ramorumole Khanyane, following which I went to the Conference of Global Anglican Bishops at Lambeth in Kent. It's called the Lambeth Conference, and it took 2 weeks. So my body is exhausted. I had hoped that I will be able to attend, but I arrived a day ago, and I've sadly had to change my plans just to allow the body to rest. But my heart is with you. You know, Professor Mokalong and the university community, how much University of Limpopo, we called it TEFLOP then, is important in my heart, in my soul, and dare I say, in my sinews. And so today my task is very simple, and it won't take me long before you are introduced to the person you really have come to listen to. As a trustee of the Archbishop Makgoba Development Trust, I am here to tell you about the trust and what the purposes of the trust and the lecture are. We, the Makgoba family and other trustees, launched the trust in 2012, 10 years ago, as a small grant-making body to deal with some of the legacies of our past. Its formation has its roots in the needs expressed on a daily basis to me by individuals and community projects. People who write to me as Archbishop or show up at the gates of Bishop's Court asking for assistance. The nature of those needs has influenced the trust fundraising strategy and its choice of beneficiaries in grant making. The three legacy areas of the trust are food security, social justice, and education. Over the last 10 years, the trust has made significant impact in these areas, as we have extended support to individuals, institutions, and communities to pursue their educational and development goal, with a special focus on those in financial distress. This public lecture falls in the legacy area of education. It is in one of the 7 universities that the trust sponsors. Here, of course, at the University of Limpopo, where we started, at Rose University, at the University of Mpumalanga, at the University of the Western Cape, at Fort Hare University, at Walter Sisulu University, and lastly, at the Nelson Mandela University. We are still in conversation with the National University of Lesotho and hope they will also join in. Again, my warm thanks to our speaker and to the university for partnering with the Trust in establishing this dialogue for platform with the hope that we will find African solutions for African problems. God bless you, God loves you, and so do I.
I think that is the end of the message. Thank you very much. I know Prof. Dr. Makgoba is not here, Archbishop Makgoba is not here. Can we please give him a round of applause for that message? Another African wrote, I see an African who's responsible. I see an African who's a hard worker. I see an African who, when he sees or looks at the mirror, sees the hand of God at work. Choir, can you welcome our Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research and Innovations and Partnerships, who is going to introduce to us the kind of African we are going to listen to today. As we introduce the guest speaker of the day. Professor Singh, Can we give Professor Singh a round of applause as she comes to introduce the guest speaker?
Vice Chancellor and Principal, Honorable MEC, Honorable Guest Speaker, Archbishop Thabo Makgoba, who is watching us online, honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you all. It is a pleasure and an honor for me to introduce our guest speaker for this morning's function. Advocate Tembeka Ngokaitobi. Can you see I've been practicing? He is Walter Sisulu, comes from Walter Sisulu University as an alumnus and a South African legal practitioner, political activist, author, speaker, and the current WSU chairperson of council. He has been tremendous in his practice and has contributed massively to the South African community. He also holds the degrees of Master of Laws, LLM, from Rhodes University and the London School of Economics. Yes. In his early years as a lawyer, he served as a law clerk to Chief Justice Arthur Chaskalson at the Constitutional Court of South Africa. He also worked as a candidate attorney and as director of its Constitutional Litigation Unit at the Legal Resources Center. Advocate Tembeka is also an acting judge at the Land Claims Court of South Africa, with his notable work in that regard being the Msiza case. He achieved an enormous feature in 2019 when he became a senior counsel just 8 years after he became an advocate. Now wait for it. He has authored a book which was launched in 2019 called The Land is Ours, South Africa's Black Lawyers and the Birth of Constitutionalism. That's what earlier on the program director was talking about. So now you know the author. And we are so privileged to have him in our presence this morning. His areas of practice include administrative law, constitutional law, and general regulatory law. So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you Advocate Tembeka, and he's going to present the 8th annual Archbishop Thabo Makgoba Development Trust lecture. That's a long introduction, so I would like to say, ladies and gentlemen, let's all of us put our hands together with the University of Limpopo in welcoming him.
Thank you for the generous introduction. Whenever you hear people talking about you, you wonder if they're talking about the same man. But I was told to just accept all of the compliments without complaint. So thank you. And also thank you to the Vice Chancellor for welcoming me to this esteemed university. And thank you to the Archbishop Thabo Makgoba for the kind words. I remember this university well, actually, as a student. I think if I told you the years when I came here, you will start to wonder, how long have I actually lived? But I remember Gilbert Khanyago, who became a friend of mine, and he was the president of the SRC here, a bit of a Marxist, if not Stalinist, actually. And I remember a lot of other comrades from SASCO. I don't know what had happened to them. I don't see them anymore. Is SASCO still alive? I suspected something has happened. So who's the leader now? EFF SC? Yeah, that too. Thank you. giving a third lecture in 3 months. The first lecture was in honor of the former Chief Justice, my own mentor, Arthur Chaskelson, and its focus was on the rule of law. The second lecture I gave at the University of KZN, the former Westville, well, currently Westville campus, former UTW, in honor of Phyllis Naidu. There is a difference with today's lecture because the person that we honor is still alive. The other two are deceased. And there is something about honoring a person who is still alive. And it is a good thing because often we forget to tell the good deeds that people did when they were alive, and we remember them only after their demise. So it is a great privilege that I speak about a person that I have, not about, but I speak in their honor, about a person that I have great admiration for from a distance. I think I've met the Archbishop once, and on the last occasion we quote unquote met in the throes of COVID at the Walter Sisulu Memorial Lecture. So those encounters that I've had have been pleasant encounters, and so I'm looking forward to this morning. What I'm going to do today, I explained that I spoke initially about the rule of law, and I spoke specifically about the problems of the transition at the University of KZN. Today I'm going to speak about the destruction of human talent from a historical point of view and the desertification of native people, and then to ask the difficult question about whether or not it is possible in the current trajectory or in the current climate to actually confront the problems of the past. Let me start by telling a story. On the 8th of January, 1912, in Bloemfontein, under the Methodist song, Lizale Sidinga Lakho, Thixo Nkosi Yenyaniso, the South African Native National Congress was established. Its founders included Pixlika Isaka Seme, George Monsiwa, Alfred Mangena. A year later, in 1913, they were joined by Richard Msimang. Seme was 31. Monsiwa was 27. Mangena was 33. Msimang was 29. The organization that they formed, believe it or not, would later be known as the African National Congress. And it would dominate the political discourses for the entire 20th century. And it would influence similar nationalist movements from across Africa, demanding their freedom from European domination. By 1944, the founders that were youthful were now regarded as old. There was a new generation. It was impatient with their petitions, impatient with their deputations, impatient with their delegations. It wanted confrontation with the white oppressive regime. And the moving spirit behind this new generation was Anton Lembede. Now he was joined by other young people, Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Walter Sisulu. They had now replaced the founding generation, but they took their ideas on. The story tells us that the great ideas always come from the youth. Oliver Tambo was later forced into exile. Mandela, Sisulu, after sham political trials, spent a life in prison. But Mandela's incarceration in his 40s, most of his talent was spent in prison. Most of his useful lives were spent in prison. Ironically, his imprisonment inspired people in Europe, Asia, South America to see the injustices of apartheid, to join the struggle for its ultimate overthrow. By 1994, apartheid had ended, and a new democratic dispensation was born. Yet, young people coming after 1994 began to ask questions about the generation of Sisulu, of Tambo, of Mandela. Questions that ought to be asked because Mandela himself questioned the earlier generation. So today, we have young people again, driven by their own history, their own desires, and their own conditions, who want to wage a new struggle. Their concerns are still the same as the concerns of Seme, and as the concerns of Mandela, and as the concerns of Monsiwa. These are concerns about racial injustice. Those concerns haunt us today in the same way as they haunted the founding generation of the ANC. Yes, apartheid has been defeated, but only in law. Yes, colonization has been defeated, but its legacies linger on. Let me start with the forgotten histories of inequality that are an embodiment of the legacies of colonialism. Because it is impossible to speak today about how to use our talent for our own improvement and for our own development without understanding how we got here. The ANC government since 1994 has adopted and applied what you can classify as pro-poor policies. Yet, poverty and inequality have persisted. It has raised entrepreneurship as a possible solution, but the crisis of inequality remains. And we have been given some explanations for it. One, we are told that the government has got good policies, but it is poor at execution. We are told that there is massive corruption that is disrupting the ability of the state to deliver. We are told that the state is unable to implement structural reforms. And by this, they mean that the state is not selling Eskom fast enough, not selling SAA fast enough, not selling Transnet fast enough. With COVID-19, it is said that global inequalities have been exposed and there is urgency in addressing them. So, the same demand of aggressive liberalization is touted as a solution. What is missing from the debate is an analysis of structural inequality. How did we get here? And by this, I mean inequality that is embedded in the economic, social, and political processes and institutions. And this form of inequality tends to disproportionately affect a class, gender, or racial category. Someone is plainly not pleased. All right, sorry, it turns out that I just have to press it myself. So it's just a lack of skill on my part. And this form of inequality, structural inequality, tends to disproportionately affect a class, gender, or racial category in a way that renders persons within those categories unable, on their own accord, independently, to escape the inequality trap. So what they do, they give you a degree, but the degree does not feed anyone. It's this structural inequality that South Africa needs to confront. And here, it is worth to recall that apartheid's lifespan was short, 1948 to 1994, less than 50 years. Yet it looms large in our imagination of the past and present. We remember as if it was yesterday its human tragedy, its perversity, its neurosis, its illogic. And apartheid had so many opponents. But if it had so many opponents, why did it last so long? For black people, it was a system which controlled their lives in their totality. It was a totalizing system. the exploitation of African labor for the benefit of the white economy, the expropriation of the land of Africans with no compensation, the intolerable living conditions calculated to cause the physical destruction of human populations, the creation of native reserves. For those who don't know, we are in a native reserve where we are. Former native reserve, not anymore. And ghettos, African ghettos, the mass and arbitrary killings of Africans, the indifference to disease in black areas, and the confiscation of African livestock. And it was the international community that gave us the language of protest in 1973, because it declared apartheid as a crime against humanity. But, and here is to the point about structural inequality, for 2 centuries before D.F. Malan became the prime minister of the apartheid government, the British had laid the seeds of racial segregation. But before the British, the Dutch had done so. How did this happen? Let me start with the enslavement of local people. Again, a feature of our past that is missing from our present. The Dutch, although they did not invent the slave trade, they perfected it. They arrived in the Cape in 1652 on the 6th of April. For those who want to read this, go to the Van Riebeeck's journals. You will see that it was a Saturday afternoon and it was windy and sunny. They brought no land here. They brought no women. They brought no women either. You know where they got them from. Taking the methods of the Portuguese, the Dutch could violently capture or buy captured people from places like current Sri Lanka, Guinea, Bengal, Angola, Madagascar, as slave labor. And these enslaved people would later form part of an amalgam of a new society of the Cape, a new language. We know that language today to be Afrikaans, and a new race, the colored people. The British took control of the Cape in 1806. Although they set out to distinguish themselves from the Portuguese and the Dutch, they also continued to practice slave labor. And in the Cape, the entire economy was an agricultural economy. It was thriving precisely because of farm labor. That is why they were able to export grapes, wine, oranges. By 1834, the enslavement of native people of the Cape had been extended to the whole of the Western and Eastern Cape. Take, for instance, these figures. In places like Graafrenet, Stellenbosch, Worcester, and today's Nelson Mandela Bay, which is formerly Port Elizabeth, 70% of all white farmers owned the people who worked in their farms. In total, there were some 40,000 enslaved people, and that represented a 40% increase from the number of enslaved people in 1806, when the British claimed to have abolished slavery. Most of these enslaved people of 1834 were local. They were kidnapped, or they had their parents kidnapped, because a child of an enslaved person also became enslaved. Today they are referred to as the Khoi Khoi. Some of them ultimately mingled with the Xhosa. When the Dutch moved to the interior from 1834, when the Great Trek began, they too practiced forms of enslaved labor, capturing, enslaving, children of the Piketty, and children of the Tswana. When slavery was banned, they wouldn't change their practices. Instead, they changed the legal relationship into contracts of apprenticeship. Paul Kruger himself had many native people working for him, not as employees, but as enslaved people. When slavery was abolished, the slave-owning class of the Cape demanded payment to let go of enslaved people. They were, after all, regarded as private property. The Cape slave owners demanded some 3 million British pounds. But the British Parliament only agreed to pay 1 million British pounds to compensate slave owners for loss of property. And to put matters in context, in today's currency, the amount of compensation would amount to 115 million British pounds. In rand terms, it is a staggering 2.6 billion rands in compensation. Enslaved people were valuable property as well. They were integral to the white economy. Take, for instance, the statement made in 1831 by Lowry Cole, governor of the Cape Colony, who explained that slave owners were unlikely to cooperate with efforts to end slavery. They could not give up, he said, what constituted their existence. Enslaved people were also an investment in property. Owners regularly sank their entire capital investment in slaves. Corporations were established purely for the business of slave ownership. Children of slaves were the property of the slave owners. In 1833, for instance, the average price for the sale of a skilled male slave was around 150 pounds. Women, however, were sold for a little less. Take an advert published in that year that a 16-year-old housemaid was to be sold for 16 pounds and a washerwoman for 64 pounds. Mortgages, the bond economy that we know about today, were also registered in the names of slaves. And the total mortgage economy of 1834 amounted to 400,000 British pounds. So despite its perversity, slavery was good business. These practices of enslavement, which were widespread in the Cape, in the Transvaal, in Zululand, have left conditions of racialized inequalities between the slave-owning class and the formerly enslaved people. But they also introduced the belief in racial superiority. So when the Master and Servants Law was passed in the 1950s, it found conditions that were created by enslavement. Its basic tenet of unfree labor remained. 100 years later, in the 1950s, these laws would be replaced by modern labor laws. The shameful past, rooted in enslavement, however, of our labor laws remains. The racial superiority manifested in the processes of enslavement were still in place by 1948 when the National Party, under the slogan of apartheid, won the Watts-only elections and became the government. Enslavement was only the first phase in the taking away of human talent. There was another one. I refer to this as Verwoerd's ghost. So enslavement destroyed human talent. But when apartheid began in 1948, it needed qualified Africans to sustain it. It needed people that could speak to the white master race. But these qualifications were themselves subject to an overarching system of racialized inequality. And the prime instrument to perpetuate that inequality was the Bantu Education Act, 47 of 1953. Are the lawyers here? But now, prior to this, African education had been primarily focused on Christian mission stations. And when the government appointed Dr. Werner Eiselen to run a commission, what he did was to propose a state-owned education system. The point of Bantu education was explained in 1953 by Hendrik Verwoerd himself when he introduced the bill in Parliament. For him, the existing liberal missionary education showed the black man the green pastures of the European, but did not allow him to graze there. And then he would add, education should have its roots entirely in the native areas and in the native environment and the native community. The Bantu must be guided to serve his own community in all respect. There is no place for him in the European community above the level of certain forms of labor. Within his own community, however, all doors are open. When the debate began about the Extension of Education Act to extend tertiary education to Africans, Verwoerd again replied, the logic for extending tertiary education to Africans, according to him, was, we shall have to negotiate frequently with Africans. He didn't call them Africans, he called them another word, which I'm sure I will trigger a lot of people if I use it, called the K word. With blacks in the future over many issues, including education and politics. It would be better, he said, to negotiate with people who are well-informed and educated. Education, therefore, apartheid, therefore, was based on the two ideas of racial superiority and a laboring class. When it was modernized by creating a semi-skilled working class, that foundational idea of racial superiority persisted. Bantu education, in short, would reinforce apartheid. And the exploitation of labor, the deliberate deprivation of skills of black people was at the center of the system. In my own book, which has been referred to here, I point to the glaring evidence that the growth of human talent, of African human talent, was stunted and reversed by apartheid. And in addition to destroying human potential and human talent, because make no mistake, they used the most able-bodied people they could find to implement the system. And over 2.5 centuries, destroyed their potential. But another area that contributed to the destruction of African polities was the deprivation of assets. Elsewhere, I have spoken about loss of land, but there is another feature of the assets that was lost: loss of livestock. In this area where we are, look at the facts. Cattle for the Piketty were a symbol of wealth. They had multiple uses. They were food, they were labor, or they could be traded with. There were also symbols of friendship, symbols of war. There were symbols of religion, symbols of culture. They could connect the living with the dead. And by disrupting the relationship of Africans with cattle, not only did the Europeans in this area disrupt the economy, they also disrupted the culture. Expeditions of the Boers against the Piketty of the Northern Transvaal, which took place in the 1850s, against Sekwati, one of the Piketty leaders, show this point. Sekwati was accused of having encouraged his subjects to reject Boer authority. When the Boers arrived here, they insisted on being a master race. When Sekwati was accused of disobedience, there was an attack by a Boer commando under Hendrik Potgieter. Although ultimately the Piketty were not forced into submission, there was a seizure of cattle, some 5,000 cattle, 6,000 small stock, and the capture of children. And these cattle heists would continue for the next 30 years. Professor Peter Delius has recorded that in the period between 1850 and 1876, the Piketty suffered heavy cattle losses. In July 1876, large numbers of cattle were captured. In fact, as he calls it, booty in cattle was one of the main incentives to the operations of the contingents manning the forts. The Boers denied the Piketty access to grazing lands, compounding their suffering. As such, the Piketty were forced to exchange cattle for grain. There were reports only 20 years later, by February 1877, of starving children and women, as well as of cattle that had been kept in the mountains with no access to grazing fields. Witnesses also saw some 300 to 400 hides, skin hides, stacked at the capital, which gives some indication of the extent of cattle loss. With labor, with education, and with the taking of assets, Africans could finally be placed into a position of subservience. So, when we talk of freedom, what kind of freedom does not respond to the systematic seizure of African cattle? What kind of freedom does not respond to the deliberate and systematic destruction of human capital? What kind of freedom does not respond to the centuries of enslavement and black labor that ultimately produced the white economy? This setup was aggravated, not ameliorated, when the 1913 Native Land Act was passed. That act did not deprive Native people of land as it has been incorrectly recorded in history. It simply recorded in law the status quo. The deprivation itself had taken place during war in the 300 years that preceded it. It made formal into law what was achieved in war. When there was a claim by 1936 to extend the area of settlement of the natives, that extension was limited. It increased, and a lot of people don't get this fact right. 1913 gave native people 7% of the land, and Europeans 93%. It was only the 1936 Act that added another 6%, resulting in the 13% versus 87% dynamic. This is what compelled Native people into the reserves, because by law, certain areas could simply not be occupied by Africans. But ask yourself this question: how did they choose which areas would be occupied by natives and which ones by Europeans? It was the use of African intellectual output. Take the year 1910. This was the year of the great agricultural yield for African farmers. African farmers did not need Europeans to educate them about the rain patterns, about fertile soil, and about which products grow where. They knew this from hundreds of years of experience. It was the Europeans by 1910 that studied the ways of the natives, about following the flow of the rivers, following the flow of the rain patterns, following the quality of the soil. That is how they chose the areas of European occupation versus the areas of native occupation. Small wonder the areas allocated to natives are as barren today as they were in 1913. So, when they say to you, stop being lazy, work the land that has been allocated to you, ask them the question, which land? And the cattle seizures of the 19th century were completed in the 20th century when they passed a so-called betterment scheme between 1939 and 1949. That betterment scheme made it by law illegal for native people to own a certain number of cattle. In certain areas, the cattle were limited to 5, in others to 10. And it was a criminal offense to own in excess of the number prescribed in the proclamation. I asked this question again. I've spoken about cattle. And most of these cattle that I have been talking about are not today traceable as cows or bulls. Their value has transmogrified. All right, I need some English people here. I need an English honors. Their value has transmogrified into bonds, stock, cash, real estate, real modern wealth. Cattle were once cash. They were once the cash of the native people. And they could be owned privately, unlike land. They were forms of trade. And so their loss was the loss of an economy. So when we speak of the return of the land, we should be speaking broadly in terms of the return of the economy. When blacks make this call, they are often stigmatized. They are asked, what is wrong with you? Why don't you get some education and make something of your life? I think responses like this downplay the impact, not just of what was lost, but the continuing impact of racial injustice. And therefore, legal equality formal legal equality in the abstract is no longer a satisfactory answer. What we need is racial justice under the law. I want to speak then of the last of the three legs of this pot of structural inequality. And that has been the impact of what has been referred to as the mineral energy complex. The discovery of gold and diamonds, and the effect it had on the disruption of native lives. By the late 19th century, British speculators descended into South Africa. By the end of that century, they had made fortunes. Their main pioneer was Cecil John Rhodes. His belief was that it was useless to have grand political visions without the cash to pursue them. In Kimberley, many Tswanas, many Xhosas, many Zulus, many Pedis were sent to work in Kimberley. He would establish the De Beers Consolidated Mines, which at some point controlled 90% of the world's output of diamonds. Later on, he would also form Goldfields of South Africa Limited, one of the richest and most powerful companies in the world. And politically, the discovery of gold was more important than the discovery of diamonds. And now, with the financial means that Rhodes had obtained, he could devote his attention to the organized settlement of today's Zimbabwe, which he called Rhodesia. And his importance to England itself is evident from 1889, when a decision was made by none other than Queen Victoria to grant Rhodes the Royal Charter of Incorporation. And that Charter of Incorporation effectively made Rhodes's company to operate like a country, a state, with the army. So when South Africa was formed, only in 1910, this mineral revolution still depended on a labor force and a skilled artisan base. But in addition, it depended on a massive migrant workforce. And in order to continue the mineral production, the British required large numbers of able-bodied black men to extract. But they could never pay them enough to self-sustain. Because as Rhodes put it, if they are able to self-sustain, they will have no reason to continue working for us. This mineral revolution expanded in the 50 years between 1910 and now it was driven by segregation and apartheid. But apartheid now had acquired a new ally, a new friend: capitalism. So not only were blacks confronted with racial inequality, they were also confronted with capitalism with a racial angle. So, as South Africa's transition took place in the 1980s, the legacies of enslavement and the destruction of human potential, the legacies of what I refer to as the desertification, and the legacies of capitalism, which has its origins in the mineral energy complex, were the three underpinnings of structural inequality. And what did we want to do about this? And could we in fact do anything about it? And is it not your job as it was Seme's job in 1912, and it was Mandela's job in 1949, and it was Lembede's job in 1944, to dismantle the trinity of racial capitalism, of mineral control, and the deacidification. The promise of the transition was social justice. This is what is at the heart of the constitutional system. It's social justice. And this is evident in some of its clauses. Number one, the Constitution promises an unqualified right to equality. It promises the restoration of land. It promises houses for all. And it promises property rights for the previously disadvantaged. It promises free education, and it promises access to healthcare services. But what has been the outcome of these promises and the structural legacy of inequality? In 2019, we received a sobering report from the World Bank about the state of South Africa's socio-economic progress. This is what it said. Counting from 1994, when we had a government that belongs to us. It said South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, judging by any measure. It found that for about 76% of the population, register this in your head, for about 76% of the population, poverty is a menacing threat to their lives. Nearly half of the population of South Africa is considered chronically poor. And at the upper bound national poverty line of 992 rands per person per month as of 2015. In the last 5 years, that has declined. And this segment of the population, which is 50%, is characterized by high poverty persistence. But even the segment that is slightly above that has a high chance, and this is what is referred to as the transient poor. But they have a high chance of falling back into the trap of poverty. And a third segment, the non-poor and not yet rich, are themselves vulnerable and continue to face an average risk of slipping into poverty if their basic needs are not met. This is the statistics before COVID. And these two groups, the second and the third, make up 27% of the population. This is why, in total, we talk of close to 80% of the population, which is primarily African, where poverty is a constant, permanent, menacing threat to their existence on a daily basis. It also found that race, and I spoke to you 30 minutes ago about the origins of racial supremacy. Race remains, this is 350 years later after the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck. Race remains a strong predictor of poverty in South Africa, with black Africans being at the highest risk of being poor. Large families, children, and people in rural areas are especially vulnerable, remaining impoverished for long periods. Poverty is also gendered. Not only is it racialized, it is also gendered. The poverty incidence is higher for women than for men. But poverty is also regional. Most municipalities in the 20 poorest local municipalities in 2016 were where? Eastern Cape, Limpopo, which is where we are, in case you didn't notice, and KwaZulu-Natal, So we are in the area with the highest incidence of concentration of poverty on racial and gender lines in the country. And 15 of the 20 poorest municipalities were also situated in Eastern Cape. 4 were in KwaZulu-Natal, and 1, Mutale, in Limpopo. And it also found that all the 10 poorest municipalities are in the former homelands of the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. Again, highlighting the enduring legacy of apartheid racial fragmentation. In addition, and I spoke about desertification, the deliberate taking of assets of African people, the World Bank also found 350 years later that asset distribution is also a strong marker of net wealth inequality. And it found that for the poor, the financial assets represent 36% of total assets, while among the rich, financial assets represent 75%. Similarly, poor households have a very small share of mortgage in total liabilities, while for the rich, this share is close to 58%. But they also found, and this is the last of their findings, that wealth and poverty transfer across generations. At least a third of all sons born to poor fathers will themselves likely be poor. And sons born from rich fathers will likely be rich. The crisis we face, you and I face, as children born by poor fathers, is breaking the cycle of poverty. But we face the challenge of breaking the cycle of poverty in imperfect conditions of structural poverty. The question is, what are we going to do about it? We can no longer ask Nelson Mandela to solve it for us. He did his job. He's now gone. We can no longer ask Thabo Makgoba to solve it for us. He's also done his job. We must ask ourselves to solve it for ourselves. So where do we go from here? I want to start with the broad idea of structural inequality. The idea that is propounded repeatedly, which is, let's make certain changes, let's break up certain parastatals, is not going to address the problem of structural inequality. And this is not my view. It's the International Labour Organization which noted that structural inequalities cannot be resolved by labor and market policies alone. One of the solutions is giving assets to poor people so that they could use those assets to take themselves out of the poverty entrapment. One of those, and the most simple and evident, is land. And land reform, which is designed to help the poor to care for themselves and their offspring, is part of the reforms necessary to address inequality. We have a high concentration, a very high concentration of land in very few people. The statistics of land ownership produced in 2017 show that for agriculturally valuable land, land that is agriculturally productive, 72% of it is still owned by white people that constitute less than 10% of the population. And even within that concentration, it is specific numbers. By 1994, 80% of agricultural productive land was owned by 60,000 families. 60,000 families, right? That has not substantially changed. We still have 4% of the population owning 72% of valuable agricultural land. And for as long as that concentration persists, we cannot talk about addressing structural inequality. This was not always the idea. When the ANC came into power in 1994, it always saw land redistribution as a key component of addressing economic inequality. Its own reconstruction and development program referred to land redistribution as an instrument to generate large-scale employment, to increase rural incomes, and to eliminate overcrowding. And when it referred to redistribution, it perceived the idea of redistribution as granting and guaranteeing access to residential and productive land to those who need it but cannot afford it. Now think about the significance of that statement. The ANC's plan, when Nelson Mandela became the president, was to redistribute the land, residentially and productive agricultural land, to who? To those who need it but cannot afford it. We know who needs the land and cannot afford it. It's the graduates of the University of Limpopo when they try to get a job in Johannesburg. And it's crucial to see the distinction, because it was both residential land and agricultural productive land. So it was houses. The ANC also knew that it could not achieve this by relying on the market alone. So when 3 weeks ago they published a policy document which claimed that it would now rely on land donations from landowners, it was betraying, and let's say this openly, it was betraying its own promise that is contained in the RDP document. Because the promise said that we cannot rely on the market alone. Instead, and this is what the RDP said, we must rely on both market and non-market instruments, including expropriation of land. We must ask, what happens to the promise of expropriation of land? The RDP document itself was not a diversion from the old policies of the ANC. It was a continuation of them, because the same undertaking on the redistribution of residential and productive agricultural land to those who need it but cannot afford it also appears in the Ready to Govern document published in 1992. It was always this prime instrument in order to eliminate land hunger and poverty in the country. Quite apart from the betrayal of this promise by current folk tongue speak, there has also been a surrender of the constitutional obligation. How did this surrender happen? Land reform today is dominated by landowners. How? They decide the price of the land. They decide the uses of the land. They decide which land is made available for acquisition by the state. They decide who, in fact, uses the land. And they decide the use of the land post the transfer. This is why, out of all land made available under the redistribution program, not on the restitution program where there's no choice, but under the redistribution program, 99% has been grazing land, not where they grow oranges, not where they grow bananas, not where they grow lucrative agricultural products. It is because the system is designed in a way that promotes the interests of landowners, not the landless. That is where there has been a surrender. It has been a surrender of constitutional obligations. This is not political speak. It's the Constitution that requires the state to make the land available to those who need it on a progressive basis. But the government has betrayed the promise in the Constitution by surrendering political power to a small agricultural elite. The main point of the future is to break the landowner veto so that land reform is driven by the state prioritizing the interests of the landless rather than the market prioritizing the interests of the landowners. This is what the Constitution demands. Yet again, quite apart from the reassertification, because the Constitution is an instrument to put back the assets of African peoples that were taken away under colonialism and apartheid. That is what that manifesto is about. But we know that putting land or other assets in the hands of an uneducated society is itself futile. So without a sustained education system, we have a hollow right. We have achieved universal access, although there are breaking points along the way. But the problem of quality, the problem of relevance remains. And although access to tertiary education is largely guaranteed by institutions like the National Financial Student Aid System, it is also challenged by the numbers that are demanding access to education and the shrinking resources available to guarantee that system. But it is also challenged in another way, which is the attempt to use our universities as photocopies of European universities to try and achieve the same thing that Harvard University is trying to achieve, or the same thing that Oxford University is trying to achieve, and to forget that our universities are serving African communities in Africa. And this is why we have a crisis of a mismatch of outcomes that people say we are not producing graduates for employability, because there is a mismatch between what the universities are trying to do versus what the market is expecting. So the key is changing the orientation. It's the paradigm. It's changing the paradigm. I want to end. Legacies of enslavement, legacies of cattle theft, legacies of the destruction of the human potential are forgotten in our memories. But they created conditions for the seizure of the land. But they amplified the impact of land and dispossession. And if we are to tell the inequality story, if we are to tell the true demand of our Constitution, we must return to these legacies. We must return to thinking broadly about cattle theft, to thinking broadly about the destruction of human talent, and therefore the rebuilding of human talent by Africans, for Africans, to serve African societies. And this is not about the past. It is about the complexities and the various ways in which that past continues to shape the present. As one author stated, the past is not even past And thinking meaningfully about today requires us to expand the horizons of our inquiry. It requires a new imagination of the possibilities of that future. But it requires an acceptance that the possibilities of that future are constrained, perhaps stunted, by our impoverished understanding of the past. And when all is said and done, it is simply not possible to confront these legacies without grasping their underpinnings. And although it is clear that in the first 27 years of constitutional democracy, the outcomes that we hoped for have not been achieved, there is inspiration in this message. There is inspiration in going back to Seme. There is inspiration in going back to Lembede. There is inspiration in going back to Mandela. There is inspiration in thinking about the problems of their time, in thinking about their own lives, about how to confront problems of their time. But there is no value to be gained by questioning whether they did enough or not, or whether or not they dismantled the system for us. What we should be inspired by is that they tried to create a future that they wanted. That is our message. It is to try to create the future that we want. Thank you.
Another one. Senior Counsel Advocate Tembeka Ngukaitobi. Thank you very much. As you are speaking, I hope you are reflecting back over the years. I could see Mr. Homeswana going back, shaking his head, reflecting on his thoughts as this was playing out on the podium. I could see those who were there most of the time earlier in the years reflecting on those experiences. And I can see when he was mentioning some of the best ideas came from the youth. I saw the youth slides lighting up and thinking, where are we in this dispensation? What is our role? And what can we do to take this land forward and shape the future from the past we have learned? Thank you very much. Another round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. That is a privilege. Now I understand why the hall was full before he arrived and patiently waited. Prof. Maffeo, you would guide me as always. I know there might be a lot of enthusiasm and questions, and we might have a never-ending round of questions. Let me now welcome some questions. And Advocate, you can please answer from where you are seated so that you don't have to run back and forth. We will take some sets of questions. I already see a hand. I already see another hand. I already see another hand. In front of you, there are gadgets. You simply press. Now it is the time where you can press and speak. And we'll take a round of 3 or 5 and then see where we go from there. Please, as you ask the question, identify yourself and then proceed to ask the question. The gentleman over there. And we had
thank you very much. Lusanda Ncisana is my name. Enkosi mntanomhle ngamazwi amnandi. You mentioned about the cattle and the destruction of our culture. So I know that the rural development is close to your heart. Today, the human population and the working class is a threat to our livestock. If you go around the country, you see that the working class is moving away from the suburb and coming to our rural areas and build nice houses with swimming pools. Those land, it's a grazing land. Now the cattle, they reduce the grazing capacity for our livestock. There was a case in King Williamstown where the working class invaded the space for grazing and the community lost that case. What needs to be done to protect the smallholder farmers in rural areas? Another question is, because we are talking about our great Bishop Makgoba, he released a statement some days ago, which was triggered by the Phala Phala saga, which is not unpopular. He did the same in the Mamu Sisulu funeral against the Nkandla saga. He made a statement about there must be no law for the rich and the poor. So, as a mitochondrion of the legal, what is your take on that? Okokugqibela mntana omhle, it will be injustice not to talk about women in this month of women. I like it when you mention about the destruction of the talent. Bishop Makgoba was one of the people who were singing the song, the anti-colonial song called Senzeni Na. Today, the women of South Africa are still singing the same song. This very university has lost one of the talented young female through the killing of men. Is it not enough that we are still singing the Senzeni Na song? As a legal person, what needs to be done to curb this injustice against the killing of women and children? Enkosi mntana omhle.
Thank you. We'll take another question.
Thank you for the opportunity. I have two short questions. My first question is, since we know what we know, why are we stagnant as a country and a continent? And why are we not moving forward? What is actually holding us back? And given your expertise from the School of Economics, in your opinion, why isn't Africa pushing for a single currency? And wouldn't that help in uniting us, number one? Number two, wouldn't that also put us on the table of greater economies? Because if we base our currency on the gold that we have in Africa, we'll actually have a voice with regards to bigger economies. Thank you.
There was another hand, yes.
My name is Khaogalo Mojapelo, and I have 4 questions. Yes, 4. I would like to know the inception of the memorial lecture considering the topics covered on an annual basis. The second one is, with all these colonial legacies advocated for by the professionals, how do you think the role of public institutions towards the fulfillment of the 17 SDGs as outlined by the United Nations? The third one is, you partly mentioned the colonial patterns weren't changes, instead they were formalized. Can that be justifying factor as to why we operate in a system of corrupt leadership without upholding the interest of black people who are never held accountable? And lastly, From your keynote, it goes without doubt that the resolution is being breached, if not betrayed, by our current cohort of leadership. What is the significance of such events and many other such events, national programs such as Youth Day commemoration, yet there are no changes, as Tupac would say? Thank you.
I think we have an excess of 8 questions already from the 3 speakers. We can allow Senior Counsel Advocate to respond.
Thank you. I hope I'll be forgiven for sitting down. You know, I think in general, my sense is that you can call them as public intellectuals if you want, if you believe that they're intellectuals. But the sense is that my role is to highlight the problems and to try and to be as clear as you can, so that this idea that there's freedom, so what's your problem? We've got to constantly question it, because my concern is that the democratic project is not delivering substantive outcomes to black people. So that's my fundamental problem, is that we've got formal democracy, but we haven't got substantive outcomes. And the longer that pattern persists, the more we create conditions of, I wouldn't say unrest, because that's a bit alarmist, but I think the longer the more we create conditions of discontent. So, and my role is to then try and give an analysis of, from a historical point of view, what are the fault lines that we have not yet engaged with. So that's one of the things I'm trying to do. The second project I'm trying to do is to investigate stories of black legacies. It's not as if black people were watching all of this destruction happening and doing nothing about their lives, right? But the problem was that the colonial project went alongside erasure of black experiences. So the second thing is to find those black experiences, document them, and then send them out for public consumption. So for instance, the life of Seme is remembered in an obscure way as the president of the ANC, who didn't really succeed as the president of the ANC, and in fact almost destroyed the ANC. But what is forgotten about his legacy is actually that he was an exceptionally talented lawyer representing the king of Swaziland against the colonial taking of the land in Swaziland, including all the way to the Privy Council, and the case is reported in 1926. Or take someone like Alfred Mangena. Actually the name is not even known. If you just go to the Google, yes, look for Alfred Mangena, you'll find Alfred Nikita Mangena from Zimbabwe, who was a member of ZIPRA. But the first Alfred Mangena from this country, his name is just unknown. And yet, if you went to England and you look for a book on the law of delict, or they call it the law of torts, there is a case called Mangena versus the Times. Now, that was the Alfred Mangena who sued the Times for defamation, and then in the process set the principles of the law of defamation, or the law of torts, as far as defamation is concerned. So those legacies, just those stories of inspiration, that in a climate of a total colonial project, you've got to find pillars from which you can rely, and that's the second project. So it's the project of trying to unearth the vast extent of the legacy of empire, but in that legacy of empire, trying to work out what were the black experiences, what were black people doing, and there you find a vast array of different experiences. So that's where I'm coming from with this, and that's why I'm never really prescriptive about solutions, because my project is to challenge us not to accept the status quo. This is abnormal. So that's my choice. We shouldn't accept the status quo. It's to reject the status quo and to think meaningfully that there is an alternative way of being. This way in which things are happening is not destined for. It is not meant to be like this, and we should be thinking about challenging it. All right, so that's why I don't like giving answers in a way that prescribes. I mean, that I think I'll leave to the politicians. There's an MSc here. Because in a way, I am also talking to the politicians, because I am also trying to say that they have betrayed their own promises. This constitution was drafted by the ANC. And they've betrayed the RDP, they've betrayed Ready to Govern. There's just so many, it's an endless list of things that they promised that they were going to do, and not only are they not doing them, but they're acting contrary to them. That's the role of academics, that's the role of public speakers. They must highlight the fault lines in the hegemonic class. They may not like that, but, well, sorry. So the really great question, I think, came from the lady here who says, well, if we know all of this, what's holding us? I mean, that's wonderful, exactly. But that's my point, is that, firstly, we need to expand the horizon of knowledges about the past, and then we have to work out what is holding us. My own assessment, and based on specific examples, there is an emerging alliance between the government, the private sector, and chiefs, traditional leaders. That is working against the interests of the poor. The government is finding it extremely difficult to upset private capital. And not only is it finding it difficult to upset private capital, it is finding itself a mouthpiece of private capital. And that is why it is abandoning. It doesn't announce when it's abandoning pro-poor policies. It goes to a conference and it says, let's do expropriation without compensation, and it never tells anyone that we are now abandoning it. And then you just see a new policy which now says the way forward on land is land donations. And you try and work out who sponsored this resolution. You actually find that it was landowners who sponsored the resolution. And so one of the key problems is this unhealthy relationship between private capital and the ANC. This is a revolutionary party that is meant to dismantle the status quo. But instead of dismantling it, it's perpetuating it. And I think one of the key problems is really for the ANC to stand up to private capital and to champion the interests of the poor. And I think this is why even, as there's someone else who spoke about corruption, I mean, that is why even this story of corruption has to be understood in this context of a class that is accumulating wealth, but it's doing it on the carcass, right? Carcass of African people that are the underclass. This is inevitable. If you have an economy that's not growing, that's not producing employment, that's not creating new industries, where are the black capitalists going to emerge from? They can only do so as appendages, literally as appendages of white capital, because white capital accumulation is not being broken or dismantled, and new industries are not being formed, but people are getting rich. So where are they getting rich from? Because ordinarily the way to get rich is to invent something, to invent a cell phone and to sell it. But if you're not inventing a cell phone, how are you getting rich? So you are getting rich because you are taking the money from the government, or you are taking the money as an appendage of the private sector, which itself actually depends on the government for its sustainability. So that, I think, is one of the structural problems that have to be confronted. I'm not sure about the single currency. I think economists should answer that. I've got my skepticism, because even in Europe, when they introduced the euro, they actually found that the Germans just went back to the German mark, and the British went back to the pound, the French went back. So even there, they tried it, and then now they're dismantling it, etc. I'm not sure. I'm a bit skeptical about the common currency. What I'm worried about is the continuing legacies, is the change in government, so that there are now black people that you call president and no longer F.W. de Klerk, but the true demand of the struggle is not met. Look, I agree about, this thing of women. It's really, really, the violence against women in this country, has reached a crisis proportion. And there's a combination of reasons why it is where it is. Firstly, society is patriarchal, and men are violent people. It's a sad thing to say, but men are very violent people. And the violence that you find is actually strange. I once spoke to a senior police officer. I think the year was 2015 or 2014, where she was talking about the murder rates that year. I think it was 18,000. I think now we've long exceeded 20,000 murders every year. I think that year was 18,000. So I said, but you've got these statistics like where every year you say, okay, 15,000 people have been killed, etc. So what's the problem? So she says one of the problems they face as the police is that most of these crimes are taking place in intimate settings. So it's a husband killing a wife, or a boyfriend killing a girlfriend, or friends who've been drinking together. And then she says, well, in that context, you can't really put a cop, in every bedroom, But the big point that she was making, which I think is a big insight for me about the scourge of GBV, is that as a woman, you have a greater chance of being murdered in the hands of an intimate partner than in the hands of a stranger. There's something sick about the society that operates like that. There's something really, really baffling, So the closer you are to the person, the more likely that you will harm them. So that's the one point that she made, and I do think it's one of the. And of course, there's a problem. Even where a report is made. I remember dealing with a client. She tells me her story. So she has been beaten up so badly by the boyfriend, and she's still bleeding, in the face. And then she goes to a charge office to report this thing. So as she walks in, the cop says, no, go outside and clean yourself first, before you come in. I don't want your, blood and stuff, There's also something wrong with that. Where should she go? She's at the police station. She must now go and find a tap around. Just makes no sense. I was trying to do a civil claim there for her, because the violence continued, So, and I was trying to hold the police vicariously liable for the conduct of the station commander. Yeah, so I don't have the answers with that. In fact, I'm not giving any answers. I'm just reflecting on what I think. Public institutions, I don't have an answer. You've got the VC here. Maybe he can tell you. Thank you.
Probably the answers lie in us. The answers lie with us. I took a set of 8 questions in the previous setting. I'm going to take a set of 8 questions. If one speaker asks more than one question, I would have to cut down one more speaker. So I am requesting, if you raise your hand, only one short question. Otherwise, we will sit here the whole day. We do know why he's here, and now we understand why he's here. But limit to one question, and then I'll take the hand as they are, starting from the bottom. And please don't talk about the potatoes and the mangoes in the field. I know that's your passion.
That is the gross ignorance that we have here as in a dam that farming is a God-given job from humanity. They've taken it out from us deliberately, and we know it. And Adam did not have some PhD or some masters from University of Limpopo. He was there farming, doing it. So biblical scholars can attest to it. It's there in the Bible. So what I want to tell you, in 1974, we had what we call the World Food Conference or Summit in Rome. Our colonial masters set up a conglomerate to stave off the hunger. 49 years ago, 50 years ago, they said, in a meeting, they called all presidents, they said, no, we want to wipe out hunger. Everybody agreed, they paid taxes and levies, everything. Did it happen? Nothing. Today, Africa constitutes 1.4 billion people are Africans on earth. Get it very clear. 1.4 billion people are African. And that is 16% of the world population. And they are continuing stealing from us. And then you have people who are over 250 million starving. I want to tell us here, not anyone else, here who is doing what and wrong. 250 million people as we sit here are starving. And 3.2 million are dying every year. People are dying, they are not food secured. I wonder if you can go to teach in your class on a hungry stomach, or you can do anything hungry. 3.2 million Africans are starving. Okay? And again, that is 50% of the world population. I'm not done. The people who are giving you free seeds, the people who are giving you fertilizers, irrigation schemes, all those flashy things, guess what they do? 40% of the food, they dump it in the dustbin. They don't eat it. It's too dead. They kill a chicken and eat the breasts and leave out the rest for compost. Yet we are starving. If that food were to be recovered, food security is guaranteed. Everyone will eat. But they don't want to do that. They don't. Listen, I'm not done. And then what is this skills development? Where does this skill development comes in? Agriculture is very simple. I told you, God just subjected it to Adam, so there were no need for complications. Now, where does skill development comes in agriculture? Skill development has an act. The MEC can attest to it. The Act of Act number 97 of 1998 says, one, government has an obligation to call the university, to bring sponsors, to bring the untrained youth, people without knowledge, so that they get the knowledge that we become food secured. And what are we doing? We're doing nothing. We're sitting here having a nice meeting, and bye-bye, it's done, and everybody goes back. We have perfume. Can we do something? Can we do something? Food security, skills development, human health, it cannot exist in isolation. Never. If you see it,
Thank you. I think we can take the next speaker. I think we are good enough for that. Please let's be short. Let's be as short as possible. We already had the lecture. We just need comments and questions, please. The gentleman with the hat.
So there are a lot of things that are happening. So ministers are just taking things without being held accountable for those decisions. For example, I can give you an example of Land Bank. Land Bank has now been what accountability has been taken for those leaders. Enough accountability. The Minister Patel of imports in South Africa. Taking into consideration scrapped of those tariffs, let's ask ourselves where or how are our local farmers going to be coping? The poultry farmers, how are they going to be coping? What about their employees? Where are they supposed to go? Did Minister Patel have a meeting with Minister of Agriculture to ask her and communicate about how is that going to be affecting our local industry of chicken production? Where are they not being held accountable for what they are doing? And what amount of accountability can be enough to scare off these ministers from taking decisions which are going to be hating our South African economy? That's my question. What amount of accountability can be enough to ensure that these people do not take bad decisions in those seats, not just firing them? That's not enough accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking for the lady with the hair. Yes, thank you. That will be the last speaker. I did warn that if you take too long, you're taking other people's questions. It is not my fault. If she's short, I'll take another one. Absolutely, absolutely. She has the book. She has the book. The land is ours. Igama lamakosikasi malibongwe. Thank you. That is how you ask it. I'll take another question because of that, of how she asked that question. I'm looking for a woman. There's no woman here. I'm looking for a woman. I'm looking for a woman. I can't see a... My choir member at the back, please go ahead.
Okay, I greet the house. Okay,
Wonderful, wonderful. Give a round of applause, please. Ladies and gentlemen, that is how you ask a question, not a lecture. Advocate, please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm also very impressed with these questions. I mean, I think the lady who spoke last, yeah, she clearly, got word for word of what I was trying to say. I mean, I think in South Africa it's impossible to separate racism from capitalism. It came as racism, and capitalism has a unique feature that it was founded on racial exploitation. Because the first two capital industries was diamonds and gold. The capitalists were white, and in the seizure of diamonds in Kimberley, I mean, the whites claimed that they discovered diamonds. All of that is nonsense. The diamonds were not discovered. They found them here, and black people were already trading with them. And the same thing, the nonsense about discovering gold. Gold was not discovered, but all of those are discredited theories, which they now know. But it's clear that the development of global capitalism from South Africa was founded on racial exploitation. So I think in this country it's impossible to separate race from capital. The two go together. The question, and I think that's why, I mean, your question is again excellent. The question then is whether you overthrow racism and you leave capitalism, and whether you can separate overthrowing racism from overthrowing capitalism, or whether or not you must overthrow capitalism in total in order to get rid of racism. This is the old conflict between the Communist Party and the ANC, members of the so-called tripartite alliance. Deracialization of capital has not worked. We've witnessed it, we've lived here. What has instead happened is that there has been a capture of a small elite that has joined the capitalist ranks. And there has also at the same time been a development of an underclass. And that's the dynamic that we have missed in the evolution of the South African socio-economic state, is that there has been, I would say, black upper class, that strata that has evolved, and it has evolved primarily because the policies of the ANC have changed, and they have enabled the acceleration of the formation of the black middle class. Others are professionals working for government, etc. Others are working at universities, etc. But they've joined an upper middle class strata. But as capitalists, if you can use the old Marxist definition, someone who controls means of production. But as capitalists, we simply have not gone there. The capitalists are still an overwhelmingly small white group. So we have not been able to deracialize capital. What we've done is that we've grown a massive black underclass. The gap between rich and poor people is wider, if you look at black communities, is wider now than it was in 1994. So which means that there has been a decline, an actual material decline in the living standards of African people. I mean, that is a massive indictment, because one of Mandela's main goals was to expand social security in order to deal with the incidence of poverty. But even as you expand social security, the growth of the underclass has just multiplied. And that's what the ANC has simply been unable to address. It's the underclass dynamic. So that takes us back then to the main question, which is, how are we going to deal with the effects of capitalism? So one idea is that there are other forms of capitalism, in other words, capitalism with a human face. I'm not sure about that, but it is being suggested. The other is there is probably social democracy that can coexist with capitalism. In other words, capitalism with redistributive features, right? And then the other is let's go for socialism straight. So some authors, I saw a book recently by Thomas Piketty. I was actually reading it in the last week, the short book. Piketty has now moved fully into embracing socialism, right? And he says at the beginning that he was once a skeptic of whether to embrace socialism, because he somehow thought that the Swedish model, the Norwegian model, could work. But he is now absolutely convinced that capitalism is unreformable, and that the only way forward is to destroy it and to build new foundations of socialism. But he says that socialism, in the Marxist definition of the term, is also unworkable. So we have to be thinking about a new socialism, right? No longer a socialism that is controlled by the dictatorship of the proletariat, right? I don't know, comrades, if they are, because I think we're going to go into a party school now. So Piketty's point is that the future, and this book by Piketty is 2021, is that the future is about rethinking, not capitalism, because capitalism cannot be rethought. The future is about rethinking socialism, so that there is democracy in socialism. So there is a promise there, at least an intellectual promise, that there is a sustainable alternative, and that we are not caught in this binary between Marxist-style socialism and sort of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan style of capitalism. So maybe real intellectuals that are trying to work out what the possibilities for the future are should think about the models of reforming socialism so that it enables free enterprise, but at the same time it reduces the levels of inequality and poverty that we have. So that is what I'm currently excited about. It's rethinking of a future of socialism, but which enables free enterprise, but which also enables the people themselves to regulate, as opposed to an idea of a proletariat, which, as we know in Russia, the proletariat was actually snuffed out by the Bolsheviks. You know, I mean, Lenin was a strong man. Stalin was worse. You know, so what we don't want is we don't want a Bolshevik-style dictatorship of the so-called proletariat. So I think that's broadly where the future should be, if we all accept that we are no longer even dealing with the top 10%. We're not even dealing with the top 1%. We're dealing with the top 0.1% that's controlling so much of the world capital. Yeah, I take the point about whether or not developing skills of people in rural areas will have the implication of, introducing westernized methods, etc. I mean, I think there is scope here to talk about a fusion, because I think it's impossible to actually think of not ideal, but idealized, rural existence. I think that idealized rural existence was destroyed, not now, but destroyed perhaps in the 70s or in the 60s. The fact of the matter is that the impact of capitalism has been so disruptive to rural lives that it's impossible to imagine rural lives without capitalism, right? My own father had to live in the 60s so that he could find a job in Johannesburg and then send remittances at home. When he died, my mother couldn't survive. She also had to go and look for a job. So, and that's the story of virtually every second African family, right? So it's impossible to think that there is somehow a way in which you can isolate rural existence from capitalism. So the two go together. The question is how to make the system fairer. So I'm not so much worried about the dilution, because the dilution has happened already. Right? And it's impossible to think of black lives without the impact of Europeans. Like now, today, you know that we've been speaking in English today, the whole day. There's not a single white person here. Did you realize that? Who is that person? I didn't even notice that there's a white person. But that makes my point, that we've been speaking in English for the whole day. There's only one white person, right? So I think we are deluding ourselves to think about some kind of an idealized rural existence that excludes Europe, because Europe is now in our DNA. I don't know if any of you can actually dream in your languages. Because English is here throughout. So an idealized rural existence, I think, is impossible. I think that Europe is in our DNA, and that is the way of the future. The question is how to make a fairer future, and not quibbling about language. And in any event, universities must now be starting to actually build African languages. You know, really, they should be building rural languages, African languages. The fact that these languages are dying and Afrikaans is growing on the other side, that just makes no sense. Then the last thing I want to say, I agree with you entirely on the land bank issue and the scrapping of these tariffs. I haven't followed the story of the scrapping of the tariffs, but if it is as you say, I think there's there's an old problem about GATT and the WTO, etc., because they say, you must open up your markets because you can't say this and that. The principle, most favored nation principle, You can't favor this nation over the other nation. Everything must be opened, etc. But as Hu Jung-chan, the author of the famous text, Kicking Away the Ladder, the point he makes, that these European countries telling us to scrap tariffs, etc., and to do away with protectionism. If you look at how did Japan develop, how did America develop, how did Germany develop, how did England, how did France develop, all of them, it was through protectionism. It was through protecting local industries. And now when the third world has to develop, they are all told, open up the industries. Open the industries to what? Because we are now creating these industries so that we can consume. Not that so that we can be net exporters. No. We are always consumers of finished products and exporters of raw materials. And so they come here 4, 5, 6, 10 times the price. So there's something there to be discussed at the WTO and at GATT about the fairness of the world trading system. But your point about accountability is spot on. The ANC has learned the ways of dealing with rural masses. So now I was in my village the other day, everyone is very pleased with this 350. You actually don't know how popular it is. That 350 is magic. Every month, everyone goes to the post office, and they start queuing at the post office the night before. So 9 o'clock, the queues start building. Everyone is waiting for the 350. Now, here is the trick, MEC. If you can increase that to 500, the people will love you. And they were saying so. They were saying the 350 is too small. We want Ramaphosa to increase it to 500. So they have learned and mastered that art, is that the masses need sort of a minimum cash existence so that they can get themselves from one day to the next day. But insofar as hard structural changes that will take a majority of people out of poverty, it's been a dismal failure, complete dismal failure. Now, you are talking about accountability. I'm very pleased you are saying this thing about accountability. We are the ones voting the ANC. We are the ones who can vote them out. But and the best mechanism of political accountability is the vote. It's not the party itself, it's the vote. So the system is designed in such a way that, as the Freedom Charter says, the opening line of the Freedom Charter, the people shall govern, and then it says a following line, people forget the following line, it says people shall govern, and no government shall justly claim authority over the people unless it is based on the will of the people. That's the next line of the Freedom Charter. So the system is designed alongside the Freedom Charter, which is in the next 3 years, you don't like these guys, vote them out. But what I expect is that when the time comes to vote these guys out, they will be dithering, who's going to replace them, etc. As long as you continue asking yourselves that question, then you can never really exercise true accountability. So it's true that there are institutions and systems of internal accountability in government, like the public protector is there, etc., etc. But the real answer to accountability is whether we are willing, when the crunch time comes, to replace our leaders. If we are not willing to do that, then we should accept the mediocre outcomes. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, when the time comes, we should remember that the leadership roles we are given, the positions we are given, the authorities we are given, the powers we are given, are not to make us look good or to enrich ourselves, but to show the people we serve how important they are and how beautiful, how skilled, and how productive they can be. Thank you, Advocate. Thank you. I know we can have the whole day asking questions. But it's 1 minute to 1. We need to let the advocate eat. I would, he agrees. I would request my immediate boss, my line manager, Professor Mampuru, next to me here, to come and speak on behalf of the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Science and Agriculture to give a vote of thanks. Professor Mampuru.
Thank you, Mr. Program Director, Professor Matsibatlela. I know I'm standing between you and your lunch colleagues. I'm going to be brief. Mine is just a very easy job to do. Now, let me upfront thank everyone who's here for your attendance and for being such an attentive audience. Lest I would forget to mention your name when I'm singling out guests who are here that I need to acknowledge. Mr. VC and the executive management entourage who's here, thanks for your leadership and for having taken a lead in ensuring that activities of this nature are always successful at this august university. The MEC and the MMC, thanks for your attendance and for having availed yourself to honor this occasion. We really feel honored with your presence. Academic colleagues, HODs and directors of school who are here from the faculty and from the university at large, we really appreciate your attendance as well. University staff from various sections who are here, you are also acknowledged. We really appreciate your attendance as well. Students who are here, I saw that you were very, very attentive, unlike in some of the classes that you will have. I guess you learned a lot from the discussions here, and you'll take cue from what the speaker has said, and the future of this country is in your hands. And if you can take these ideas that you learn from here, a much better nation. The Makgoba family entourage that is here, you always, spot on. You don't miss this. This is your baby, and we really appreciate your presence always. The Anglican entourage that is here as well, in the absence of the Archbishop, we are also very much honored of your attendance as well. The Arch in absentia, thank you very much for having chosen us as one of the beneficiaries of your vision. The past 7 years have been a revelation. Let us maintain this godly and fruitful marriage for many years to come. As the Faculty of Science and Agriculture, we are the beneficiaries, we are the sole beneficiaries really of this, of the Archbishop's vision really. And we would like to request you to continue with this association with the Faculty of Science and Agriculture, more especially the School of Agriculture and Environmental Sciences under the leadership of Professor Mafeu, who's here, the director of the school. Senior Counsel, Advocate Tembeka Mugatobi, sir, thanks very much for the thought-provoking and intuitive exposition. The methodical destruction of human talent and potential. What a marvel to listen to. And we hope everyone who has been here and listened to your theatres have taken something home. You mentioned a lot of challenges dating back from the time when this country was usurped from the indigenous inhabitants in 1652 during the arrival of Jan van Riebeeck, with no women on board. And you can imagine when males don't have their women around, what can happen. Thanks for exposing our glory, and it was necessary to take us back to the memory lane so that we can know where we're supposed to go from here. A nation that does not learn from history is bound to, or is a lost nation. Thank you very much, Advocate. Thanks very much. And words fail me really. When I was sitting here, when he mentioned how the bellies were actually destroyed, and that history is at my heart. When he mentioned Squadi, our forefathers, I shed a tear, and was necessary to where we're coming from. And thanks again. Hey, this thing keeps on. Yeah, somebody is playing with it somewhere. As Professor Matsivatlela has said. Thanks again, Advocate, reminding us that this land is ours and we need to reclaim it and utilize it effectively. Granted, the land issue is very much from the Office of the Executive Dean of the Faculty, Professor Tlengani Siweya, who's not here. We are presence and the honor that you bestowed on the Faculty of Science and Agriculture. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of the program. Now food. The message I have from the school director and the vice chancellor and principal is that everyone will eat. All the students in the hall can remain here. Food will come to us and we'll get directives. Advocate the guests, the Makgoba family, the Anglican entourage, the staff will proceed to the staff restaurant. The choir knows where to go. Those who have the book, The Land is Ours, The Land Matters, can get their autographs. We will have a few pictures here before we leave, and the choir will continue to entertain us. The group picture is? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy the rest of the day and enjoy the meal.
Comrades.
Choir.